I realized something was wrong at 2:17 a.m. when the platform's maintenance log updated itself with my employee ID, even though my tablet was locked inside a sealed cabinet and I was alone on the lower deck. I didn't panic right away because out here exhaustion makes you blame yourself before anything else. And I had been awake for nearly 30 hours straight. But then I remembered the laminated card I was told never to lose. The one that mentioned there were 11 strange rules you had to follow to survive a full rotation offshore. I had laughed when they gave it to me, standing there in the dark, watching my own name appear where it shouldn't. I understood why nobody ever jokes about the last rule. The first time I realized the weight of Rule 1, never respond to an echo that uses your name, even if it sounds like someone you trust. I was walking along the maintenance catwalk toward the generator room, late enough that the platform lights felt harsh and artificial against the endless black water surrounding us. The air smelled faintly of diesel and salt, and every step on the metal grated beneath my boots felt like it was being measured. I had been running diagnostics for hours, my mind foggy from exhaustion and heat, when I thought I heard my name whispered behind me, so soft that I wasn't sure I actually heard it. I froze, letting the moment stretch long enough for panic to settle in, and I swore I could feel the metal under my fingers responding in a subtle, almost tactile acknowledgement. I reminded myself it was probably fatigue, the long shift blurring everything into hallucinations. But the echo had the exact cadence of one of my coworkers, someone I trusted to cover my rotation if I needed a break. I didn't speak, and I didn't move for a few seconds longer than felt safe, and the silence that followed seemed heavy, like it was waiting for me to make a choice I already knew I couldn't reverse. At that moment, I understood why the laminated card in my locker emphasized following all 11 strange rules carefully. Even minor lapses here felt amplified, as if the platform itself was aware of our errors. Out here, isolated on the steel skeleton of an oil rig miles from shore, you quickly learn that mistakes are rarely fatal immediately, but they echo. They echo long after the immediate danger is gone, shaping how the rest of your rotation feels. I kept my head down, checked the railings, and tried to convince myself that the whispering was nothing. But it wasn't just sound, it was sensation, an awareness pressing lightly against my mind. That first night, I realized how easily perception could be manipulated, and how one wrong response could start a chain reaction you couldn't see. By the time I reached the generator room, my heart was still catching in uneven beats. I pulled off my gloves and set down my toolkit, noticing that the temperature had dropped slightly, though I hadn't touched any valves or opened any doors. I told myself it was normal fluctuation, but the lingering feeling of being observed refused to fade. Each hum of the generator became more than machinery. It was punctuation on the silence I was meant to endure. I kept thinking about Rule 1, remembering the exact phrasing, because saying it out loud to myself seemed safer than risking acknowledgement of the echo. I had worked offshore before, on smaller rigs, but nothing prepared me for the oppressive awareness that this platform had, like it had memory. Shadows along the catwalk didn't match the fixtures. Reflections in the panels caught angles my eyes couldn't see directly. I didn't move at first, letting my senses recalibrate, but the echo's cadence, repeating my name in perfect imitation of a voice I trusted, stayed with me, growing sharper and more precise, as if it were testing the boundaries of my control. That realization alone was enough to make me think about the laminated card again, and how carefully I had ignored it, assuming rules were exaggerations, warnings meant to scare green technicians. Hours passed with routine checks and small repairs, but the platform no longer felt inert. Every mechanical vibration, every distant light blinked with purpose, as though it was counting. I avoided looking at the storage deck doors, the same place I had glimpsed movement moments before, thinking of Rule 1 and the lesson embedded within it. Even a fleeting acknowledgement could spiral into events you couldn't anticipate. My hands shook slightly as I noted down readings, my eyes darting at reflections in the polished metal conduits, trying to discern the difference between fatigue and something else entirely. Lunch break was mechanical, and I sat alone in the small galley, eating slowly while my mind replayed every sound from the previous hours. The platform seemed quieter here, but the silence was heavy, weighted with the memory of my name being used against me. I remembered older technicians whispering stories about first rotations, about people who had answered back and never been seen the same way again. At first I thought it was exaggeration, but the familiarity of the echo convinced me that there was an unspoken mechanism for testing, a constant evaluation of adherence. By mid-afternoon, I was running electrical diagnostics in the turbine corridor, and I noticed a subtle misalignment in one of the panels that should have been perfectly flush. My reflection shimmered in the metal for a moment, almost mimicking my expression with a fraction of delay, and my stomach sank. Every instinct screamed not to engage, not to acknowledge, and I felt the wisdom of Rule 1 settle over me, like a protective shield. I didn't speak, I didn't gesture, and I didn't turn toward anything that could have been a source. It was exhausting, but the restraint was necessary, and that was something the laminated card had taught me indirectly. The sun had long disappeared beneath the horizon by the time I returned to the maintenance deck for a final round of checks. Darkness outside was complete, indistinguishable from the oily water stretching infinitely beyond the platform. The platform lights gave no comfort. Instead, they cast long, narrow shadows that moved with me as if they were alive, echoing my hesitation. I counted every step deliberately, focusing on mechanics and readings, keeping mental distance from the whispering memory. I repeated the phrase in my head, Rule 1, as a mantra, a tether to reason, even though the echo lingered, just beyond perception, patient and deliberate. By the end of the shift, I understood that Rule 1, never respond to an echo that uses your name, even if it sounds like someone you trust, wasn't just a precaution. It was a principle grounded in survival psychology. A single lapse could fracture your perception of reality, and out here, perception is the difference between finishing your rotation and being lost to the platform's subtle, persistent memory. I recorded the final readings mechanically, noting minor anomalies, each one a potential consequence of the echo I hadn't acknowledged. My mind was a mix of fatigue and cautious awareness, each thought tempered by the knowledge that the echo was patient. Even now, when I recall that first night, the echo isn't the worst part, it's the realization that the platform doesn't forget, and neither do you. Every corridor, every reflected light, every hum is a reminder of restraint, of the careful obedience Rule 1 demands. That first exposure taught me more about isolation, observation, and the thin line between awareness and madness than any manual could. Following that rule became instinct, and I learned quickly that instinct offshore isn't just a survival tool, it's a lifeline. I learned Rule 2. Never enter a section of the platform that has been sealed for more than 24 hours, even if it appears safe the hard way. The moment I saw the temporary barricade leaning against the hatch to the south turbine bay, at first glance, it was just maintenance equipment blocking the doorway, a simple obstacle meant to be temporary. But something about the angle, the way the light from my helmet caught the scratches on the metal, set every instinct in my body on alert. I hesitated, gripping the railing, thinking back to the laminated card tucked into my locker, the one that had already saved me from acknowledging an echo. The rules here are deceptively simple, until you ignore them, and the consequences unfold like a slow, relentless tide. I thought about why anyone would barricade that section, and why the notice attached to the hatch was smeared with rust, illegible in most of the light. I debated walking around it, pretending not to notice, convincing myself that the hours I'd already spent on diagnostics counted as enough diligence. But curiosity is difficult to suppress offshore, especially when it feels like the platform itself wants to draw your attention. I leaned closer, my gloves brushing the barricade, and I could feel the weight of expectation pressing down. There is a kind of knowledge embedded in these rules that only becomes apparent when you stand at the threshold, realizing that hesitation can save you, and recklessness can leave you unrecognizable. The first moment inside the turbine bay, after I forced myself past the barrier, I felt the air change. It was heavier, thicker, carrying an almost imperceptible chemical tang, and my eyes caught shadows in the corners that shouldn't have been there. I immediately regretted ignoring the instinct embedded in Rule 2, even though my mouth said nothing. Each step I took was deliberate, mechanical, but my mind raced with possibilities. Structural issues, gas leaks, something else entirely that the laminated card didn't name but implied. I knew that the platform remembers, that every deviation from these rules is logged in subtle ways that manifest slowly, like the ocean pulling at the platform legs far below. I explored the bay carefully, taking measurements and checking the systems, noting the subtle misalignment in the piping. Everything functioned as it should, yet there was a sense of watching embedded in the shadows, the corners, and even in the reflections of my own light on polished surfaces. I had learned from Rule 1 that restraint was critical, but Rule 2 introduced a different kind of tension, the lure of discovery versus the innate warning that came with years of offshore experience. I walked slowly, feeling the platform's structure vibrate slightly under my boots, each tremor amplifying the sense that I had trespassed into a space deliberately left alone. Hours passed, and I remained in the turbine bay, running diagnostics I had already done dozens of times elsewhere. The more I observed, the more aware I became that every sealed section carries history, memory, and consequence. Tools seemed to shift subtly between glances, readings changed minutely, without explanation, and there were areas of shadow that seemed to thicken and recede in deliberate rhythm. My head throbbed with exhaustion, but I persisted because leaving this section unchecked felt like a failure, a direct affront to the implicit logic behind Rule 2. My imagination wove scenarios where the sealed spaces were more than storage or restricted areas. They were living reminders of what happens when the rules are ignored. At one point, I noticed a hatch cover slightly ajar that I had inspected minutes before, and I could swear it hadn't moved until just then. My breath caught, not because of fear, but because of the weight of responsibility. The laminated card's rules were not suggestions. They were a structure meant to tether your perception, and breaking even one, even in curiosity, felt like walking along a line where gravity no longer held. I checked every gauge, recalibrated every sensor, and made a mental note of the subtle temperature gradients along the walls, aware that Rule 2 was in effect here, in ways I couldn't quantify but could sense in the tension of the metal around me. By nightfall, I had mapped the bay completely, making careful notes, but the sense of being observed never faded. Shadows flickered at angles my eyes didn't trust, and reflections on the metallic panels made me doubt my own posture. I had convinced myself that no one could be here, that isolation made hallucinations inevitable, but instinctively, I knew that Rule 2 isn't just about physical danger. It's about mental preservation, about maintaining the structure of your awareness in an environment that actively erodes certainty. I could feel it, subtle yet insistent, as if the platform was cataloging not only my physical presence, but my hesitation and curiosity. I spent the next few hours repeating inspections, recalculating readings, and watching the platform adjust subtly to my movements. I realized that every sealed section has its own set of consequences, invisible until violated, and that the 24-hour guideline wasn't arbitrary. It was an embedded timing mechanism that dictates how long the platform's memory resets before testing you again. At some point, I stopped moving and leaned against a pipe, letting my head rest lightly, while my eyes followed the faint rhythm of light across the walls, trying to understand why the card had emphasized Rule 2 so heavily. It wasn't just about danger, it was about obedience and perception, and I was acutely aware that the line between vigilance and paranoia was razor thin. Eventually, I left the turbine bay, documenting my observations and sealing the hatch behind me, my movements precise and deliberate. I carried the weight of having entered a forbidden space, knowing that Rule 2 was intact in my mind, but violated in action. The rest of the night, I walked with a subtle, ongoing awareness, measuring my steps, avoiding idle glances, and noting every echo of my own movements. The lesson was clear: the platform records more than your presence. It measures hesitation, curiosity, and the tiny breaks in discipline that separate survivors from those who are swallowed by their own impulses. Even now, when I recount this section of my rotation, I can feel the bay behind me, the sealed shadows pressing lightly against memory, an unspoken warning etched into awareness. Every other rule, every other precaution, seems to orbit around these initial lessons, but Rule 2 carries a weight that isn't immediately visible. It is subtle, insidious, and enduring. My hands shake slightly when I think about the first moment I stepped inside that bay, not from fear of machinery, but from the deep understanding that even curiosity must be filtered through obedience, or else consequences unfold in ways you cannot fully anticipate. I realized Rule 3: never adjust any control or valve that has a Do Not Touch tag, even if it seems inactive or broken. When I stepped into the engine control corridor, leaning over a panel that hummed faintly, almost imperceptibly, beneath my fingertips, it wasn't the hum itself that startled me, but the precise alignment of every lever, dial, and indicator, as if the platform had rearranged them while I wasn't looking. I had always assumed these tags were precautionary, bureaucratic filler to keep green technicians cautious, but the moment I touched a valve even slightly, I felt a subtle resistance, as though the steel itself was aware of my intent. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I recalled the laminated card tucked into my locker. The warnings weren't hypothetical, they were memory encoded into the platform's very design. The corridor stretched longer than I expected, a ribbon of metal and tubing, and my flashlight's beam seemed to elongate the shadows, making the Do Not Touch tags appear to multiply at angles I couldn't anticipate. I debated whether this was fatigue, the kind that makes patterns seem alive, but the careful arrangement of each control suggested otherwise. My instincts screamed not to intervene, but curiosity clawed at me, subtle and persistent, as it had when I first encountered the turbine bay under Rule 2. I leaned closer to one of the larger valves, feeling the worn paint under my glove, and the notion of compliance warred with the desire to understand, to see what would happen if I defied the simple printed command. Every instinct I had accumulated offshore told me that the tags weren't merely about mechanical safety. They were about control, perception, and the subtle preservation of order in isolation. My mind traced potential consequences, from minor malfunctions to catastrophic system feedback, and I could feel the platform reacting to my hesitation. The laminated card had never specified why each rule was critical, only that violation carried consequences. Now, staring at the valve, I realized those consequences weren't always immediate, and sometimes the cost was measured in psychological erosion rather than physical harm. I forced myself to step back, straightening my posture, and tried to focus on the dials across the corridor, as if I hadn't even noticed the forbidden valve. Hours passed as I moved through the corridor, performing routine checks and calibrations that now felt different, weightier, as if the platform itself was scrutinizing every decision. I noticed subtle anomalies in readings. A gauge that hadn't moved in months now ticked ever so slightly, a light flickering in a pattern that I hadn't memorized. I resisted the urge to investigate further, repeating the warning of Rule 3 in my mind like a protective mantra. The sensation of being observed returned, not through eyes or cameras, but through the oppressive awareness that my decisions mattered more than I understood. Even in the absence of direct danger, the violation of obedience felt like a slow erosion of security, a tremor that left the nerves raw and hyper-aware. By the time I reached the end of the corridor, I was exhausted, but there was no relief in completion. The platform's architecture, every control panel, every sealed hatch, and now every Do Not Touch tag seemed alive, subtly shifting, waiting for the moment someone would ignore the guidance. I remembered the echo from Rule 1, the sealed bay from Rule 2, and now the tagged valves from Rule 3, a pattern emerging that wasn't explicitly taught but had to be learned. My reflection caught in a steel panel, and for a moment, I thought I saw my own hesitation mirrored back, as someone else entirely, as though the platform could project awareness. I continued my rounds, checking smaller control clusters, all the while aware that even slight adjustments might ripple into consequences beyond my comprehension. The mental strain was heavier than physical exertion, and I caught myself thinking of past offshore rotations, of colleagues who had shrugged off warnings, and of stories whispered late at night about technicians who didn't survive long enough to tell anyone what they'd learned. Each story, each anecdote, gained new significance when combined with the tangible weight of Rule 3. The laminated card felt almost prophetic now, a map of invisible boundaries, each one linked to survival. Night settled fully over the rig, and the corridors felt narrower, the shadows thicker, even though nothing had changed physically. Every control I passed seemed to have its own subtle gravity, drawing my attention and testing my restraint. I paused frequently, my hands hovering near levers, my mind running through every logical scenario for why the tags were necessary. The platform's memory was patient and exacting. Violations were not punished immediately, but the awareness of having disobeyed lingered, embedding itself in thought and perception. I kept my focus razor sharp, repeating the exact phrasing of Rule 3 quietly in my head to anchor myself. By early morning, I had completed the control rounds, documenting readings, recalibrating only equipment that had no tags, and carefully avoiding any interaction with prohibited levers or valves. Fatigue pressed hard against my vision, but I noticed subtle changes in the panels that had been stable the night before. Gauges drifted slightly, indicator lights dimmed for brief moments, and the sense of being watched returned, more intense and deliberate than before. Every instinct told me that these weren't errors but subtle warnings, that Rule 3 wasn't just about mechanics, it was about discipline, observation, and awareness in a place that manipulated perception relentlessly. Even now, recalling the corridor, I can feel the weight of every valve I avoided, the pressure of knowledge pressing against the edge of comprehension. Rule 3 embedded the lesson deeper than any previous rule, that even harmless curiosity could fracture your sense of safety, and that isolation magnifies every hesitation and every decision. I walked out of the corridor that morning, with hands tight around the railing, breathing slow and deliberate, fully aware that violating the tag had consequences I might not see, yet would undoubtedly feel. The platform remembered, measured, and waited. I first understood Rule 4. Never remove your helmet while on the outer deck at night. No matter how calm the weather appears, when the wind carried a faint metallic tang, and the rig's light stretched long shadows across the catwalk. I had been leaning against the railing, trying to breathe through the claustrophobia of heat inside the helmet, when fatigue made me think it might be harmless to lift it for a moment. The ocean below was pitch black, a void that made the platform appear as though it were suspended in nothing, and I could feel my own heartbeat against my chest plate, rapid and insistent. Even for a trained technician, isolation changes perception. The mind begins to fill the empty spaces with suggestions, echoes, and memories you thought you'd discarded. The first inhale without the helmet felt deceptively safe, the air tasting faintly of salt and diesel, a combination that had become almost comforting after weeks offshore. But the second breath brought a sudden awareness, as though the platform itself had tilted slightly, reminding me that Rule 4 was not about comfort but survival. Every step I had taken to get here, every moment spent ignoring small warnings, seemed to converge into this single fragile instant. The darkness around me wasn't empty. It felt measured, alive, waiting to mark missteps, and the realization that the helmet was not just protection, but an anchor hit me with the weight of hindsight. I pulled the helmet back down quickly, but the momentary exposure left me shaken in ways I couldn't immediately rationalize. Shadows seemed to gather at the edge of the lights, forming subtle distortions in the steel, and I couldn't trust my own eyes. The deck had always been cold at night, but now it felt different, almost sentient, aware of the brief lapse. I traced the railings with my gloved hands, grounding myself in the tactile reality of metal, trying to separate imagination from danger, and each step reminded me that Rule 4 was as much about maintaining psychological stability as it was about physical safety. As I moved along the catwalk, the sensation of being observed intensified, not just the platform's memory, not just the isolation, but a creeping awareness that my exposure, however brief, had been noticed. The laminated card with the 11 rules didn't explain how or why each rule was connected, but the cumulative understanding made it clear they weren't arbitrary. Each rule was a tether, a mental scaffold meant to keep you anchored in reality. By lifting the helmet, I had tested the limits of that scaffold, and the platform had responded, subtle but unmistakable, in ways I couldn't describe without feeling my throat tighten. I spent the next hour checking external valves and monitoring wind gauges, moving with a precision born of fear and respect. Every gust of wind, every glint of reflection, was amplified by the knowledge that Rule 4 forbade removing protective gear. I couldn't shake the image of the open ocean, stretching endlessly beyond the rig, and how quickly it could swallow anyone foolish enough to think they were safe. Even simple motions, adjusting a wrench, leaning against a railing, were measured against the invisible boundaries the rules had set. Each precaution became a mental exercise, a test of adherence to principles that could feel trivial until broken. I thought about colleagues who had spent their first nights on the platform ignoring these kinds of warnings, laughing at the laminated card, joking about rules that seemed excessive. The ocean below didn't forgive ignorance, and the rig itself was patient, persistent, and watchful. Every technician has a breaking point, a moment when curiosity or fatigue overrides instinct, and that moment can be fatal. As I walked along the deck, helmet firmly in place, I could sense the accumulation of every violation I had avoided so far, a ledger kept invisibly by the platform and by my own growing respect for the rules. The wind picked up slightly, carrying a spray of salt water across the outer deck, and I realized that even subtle environmental changes were amplified in the darkness. Lights reflecting off wet steel created illusions, shadows that shifted unnaturally, and I couldn't always tell which movement was real and which was a consequence of my own exhaustion. Rule 4 became not just a guideline, but a lens through which I judged every action. Every hesitant step reminded me that isolation magnifies perception, that even minor mistakes are remembered, and that survival requires more than technical skill, it requires consistent restraint. Later, when I checked the catwalk lights and cross-referenced structural readings, I noticed small anomalies I had missed during the day. Panel bolts were slightly loosened, railings shifted imperceptibly, and a faint vibration ran through the deck. I knew that these weren't mechanical failures in the usual sense. They were responses, consequences, reminders that Rule 4 was about presence, awareness, and respect. Ignoring it, even briefly, had been a lapse I would carry through the rest of the night, a warning embedded in the memory of the platform and in my own mind. By the time the shift ended, my shoulders ached from tension, and my vision felt sharpened in a way that made ordinary lights and shadows appear strange. The platform seemed to breathe with me, its steel skeleton echoing every movement, every decision, and every hesitation. I understood finally that Rule 4 wasn't just a preventative measure, it was a principle of perception, a way to navigate the psychological complexity of isolation, fatigue, and relentless observation. Following it was not optional, it was survival. Even now, when I think back to that night, I feel the deck under my boots, the wind against my helmet, and the quiet but insistent pull of awareness that kept me tethered. The platform had not forgotten, and neither had I. I moved through the night with caution, knowing that Rule 4 was a reminder of limits, of restraint, and of the subtle, pervasive influence of everything around me, measured and deliberate, as it had been from the very first echo that called my name. I first confronted Rule 5, never enter the lower storage compartments alone, especially after sunset, regardless of how routine the inspection seems late one evening, when the task of inventorying spare parts seemed simple enough. The corridor leading down to the compartments smelled faintly of oil and rust, and the steel stairs groaned beneath my boots, as though reminding me that isolation magnifies every sound. I had done this walk countless times during day shifts without incident, but now, as the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, the darkness made every shadow stretch and bend unpredictably. My flashlight barely illuminated the steps, casting distorted shapes that I could swear moved independently of my own motion. I paused halfway down the staircase, realizing that even this minor descent carried tension. The laminated card's warning about Rule 5 resurfaced in my mind, but it felt abstract until I felt the change in the air itself. A denser, heavier quality that suggested unseen eyes or perhaps a presence I couldn't identify. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet duty compelled me forward, the duality of fear and obligation pulling taut. The door to the storage compartments was ajar, and I could feel the stale, recycled air escaping into the corridor, a faint whisper of history that made my chest tighten. My hand hesitated over the handle, and in that pause, I became acutely aware that Rule 5 was as much about preserving mental equilibrium as avoiding physical danger. The compartments themselves were narrow, packed with crates, barrels, and coils of cable stacked unevenly. Shadows pooled in corners, distorted by the angle of the single overhead lamp. Each step I took echoed differently than expected, and the sound seemed to follow me, then disappear just as I tried to localize it. I moved cautiously, cataloging items, taking inventory, and adjusting straps, all the while aware that I was completely alone. The sense of observation from the platform was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present, pressing against my skin and in the back of my mind. Every detail felt amplified: the slight tilt of a crate, the faint scrape of metal on metal, the lingering scent of chemicals that hadn't been there during daytime checks. Minutes stretched into an hour as I progressed deeper into the lower storage compartments, my mind running scenarios in which the simplest mistake could spiral into something catastrophic. The platform had a way of reminding you that nothing here is trivial. Each corner I rounded carried the potential for something entirely unexpected: an imbalance in the stacks, a fallen tool, or even the pressure of isolation itself. I could feel tension gathering in my shoulders, coiling around my neck, a slow, insistent reminder that Rule 5 was about more than just staying safe physically. It was about maintaining mental clarity in an environment engineered to destabilize perception. At one point, I paused to check a barrel that had shifted slightly, leaning against another. The subtle change in alignment made my chest tighten, and I realized that I had been down here for longer than I intended, caught between task and observation. Every instinct screamed not to push further, yet I had a responsibility to complete the inspection. I ran my hands along the crates, noting dates, labels, and minor abrasions, fully aware that even this routine task could yield consequences if the rule's guidance was ignored. My eyes flicked constantly between shadows and reflective surfaces, measuring every angle, every distortion, trying to maintain equilibrium against the platform's subtle manipulations. The air in the lower compartments grew thicker as I advanced, a mixture of heat, humidity, and something I couldn't quite name. I realized the platform's design amplified perception. Every creak, every vibration seemed to be magnified, as if reinforcing the significance of Rule 5. I tried to move methodically, controlling my breathing, tracing paths I had memorized, but the unfamiliar shadows kept suggesting alternative routes and unseen presences. The laminated card's instructions, once dismissed as trivial, now felt like the only guide through a maze of uncertainty, caution, and relentless isolation. I remembered the stories whispered during early rotations: technicians who ignored Rule 5, or who attempted to hurry through the lower compartments alone, only to emerge hours later changed in subtle, unsettling ways. Faces that weren't quite right, behaviors that hinted at the lingering influence of confined, dark spaces. At the time, I had assumed these were exaggerations meant to scare rookies, but now, in the dim light of the storage corridor, every tale felt plausible, almost inevitable. The rule was not merely guidance. It was an acknowledgement of something ineffable embedded in the platform's structure, in the air, in the space itself. I made my way to the furthest point of the lower compartments, documenting inventory and checking for maintenance issues. The darkness seemed to shift slightly as I worked, each movement of my body subtly altering the shadows, almost as though the platform responded to hesitation or indecision. I had been careful, precise, yet the oppressive weight of solitude made me hyper-aware of every detail: a reflection in a metal surface, the faint change in ventilation, the subtle pressure of space closing in around me. I realized then that Rule 5 is not just a guideline for safety, it is a principle that enforces psychological stability, maintaining an awareness that protects against erosion of sanity. Time became difficult to gauge, hours blurring into each other as I continued my rounds, cataloging every item and correcting minor misalignments without overstepping boundaries. The platform's subtle feedback, invisible to any casual observer, pressed against me in a way that required constant vigilance. Shadows and reflections worked against perception, forcing the mind to rely on rules, guidelines, and instincts that had been drilled repeatedly. Following Rule 5 meant more than staying physically safe. It meant maintaining clarity of thought, preventing disorientation, and avoiding temptation to test boundaries that had been set with intent and precision. By the time I exited the lower storage compartments, the first hints of pre-dawn light were creeping across the platform. My hands were clammy, and my mind felt stretched, strained by hours of heightened perception and constant vigilance. The shadows had receded, but the memory of them, the tactile impression of the narrow, confined space, and the persistent awareness of unseen observation remained. I understood finally that Rule 5 is a subtle but critical lesson. The platform preserves more than your physical safety. It measures restraint, attention, and psychological endurance, demanding respect for isolation, darkness, and the unseen forces at play. Even now, recalling that night, I can feel the confined weight of the lower compartments, the oppressive humidity, the lingering darkness that refuses to let go. Every step I took, every careful motion, was measured by the platform in ways I could not fully perceive, and Rule 5 remains one of the clearest examples of how survival here depends not on strength or skill alone, but on adherence to principles that govern perception, judgment, and the mind. The lesson is subtle but absolute, and breaking it is not an option. I discovered Rule 6. Never trust the platform's automated lights at night. They can show you what isn't really there. The night the storm rolled in, thick clouds blotting out the moon and making the rig seem suspended in a black void. I was checking the external monitors on the catwalk when the automated lights flickered on, illuminating stretches of the deck that I could have sworn had been empty moments before. Shadows seemed to extend unnaturally long, pooling in corners and reflecting off metal surfaces in ways that contradicted logic. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure moving among the crates, only to realize the light had shifted, and the figure vanished as though it had never existed. The platform's lights were precise, mechanical, but at night they played tricks that the mind struggles to reconcile with reality. I tried to reason with myself, attributing the illusions to fatigue and storm-induced anxiety, but the more I observed, the more the light seemed deliberate, almost patient. Each cycle of illumination revealed details that weren't there before. Crates shifted, shadows stretched, and my own reflection sometimes appeared moments before I moved. I remembered Rule 6 from the laminated card tucked in my locker, and it felt simultaneously absurd and urgent. Every technician learns quickly that the rig's automated systems are not neutral. They measure movement, attention, and adherence, and the lights were one of the tools through which the platform tested awareness. As the storm intensified, the automated lights began to flicker erratically, creating patterns that defied predictable timing. I walked along the catwalk, moving deliberately, checking safety lines and railings, and each step made me more aware of how dependent I had become on these lights for navigation. I realized that reliance was dangerous. The lights could present paths that didn't exist, or erase ones that did, subtly manipulating perception. Each shadow, each reflection, became a test of judgment. The platform wasn't trying to harm me directly, but it demanded vigilance, forcing the mind to remain engaged, alert, and disciplined. Hours passed as I monitored pipelines and external valves, every movement amplified by the flickering lights. I noted the subtle inconsistencies, the same patch of deck appearing empty one moment and cluttered the next, reflections on panels that anticipated my gaze, and shadows that shifted in impossible angles. My heart raced not from fear of falling, but from the cognitive tension of navigating uncertainty. The lesson embedded in Rule 6 was clear. Trusting the lights blindly erodes your perception, and perception is your most critical tool offshore. Misjudgment can escalate quickly, sometimes imperceptibly, until there is no opportunity for correction. The platform's automation seemed almost sentient in its timing, revealing paths, highlighting obstacles, and sometimes creating phantom figures that receded the moment I blinked. I moved cautiously, using handheld instruments to verify positions and readings, rather than relying on visual cues alone. Every flicker of light became a micro-test of focus, each reflection a challenge to discern reality from illusion. I realized that even minor lapses, hesitating, glancing in the wrong direction, could cause misinterpretation, amplifying the risk. The rules weren't arbitrary. They existed to prevent subtle misjudgments from compounding into catastrophic outcomes. By the middle of the night, I noticed patterns in the lights, repetitions, cycles, and sequences that seemed to anticipate my movements. I stopped several times to double-check equipment and ensure I wasn't overlooking anything critical. The deck felt alive, responding to me in ways I couldn't quantify, and I began to sense that the platform's memory extended beyond logs and sensors. It was embedded in structural feedback, vibrations, and yes, even the automated lighting system. I understood fully why Rule 6 emphasized distrust. It wasn't paranoia, it was calibration of attention. Each inspection brought subtle shifts in my awareness. Crates appeared where none had been, shadows mirrored gestures I hadn't made, and lights flickered in unnatural sequences. I realized that trust, even in mechanical systems, could be deadly. My mental energy became a tool, a shield against deception. Every decision to move, check, or document was measured against the awareness of potential illusion. Following Rule 6 meant more than physical caution. It required constant cognitive vigilance, an ongoing negotiation between instinct, observation, and the platform's manipulations. Toward dawn, the storm passed, but the impression of the automated lights lingered. I retraced my steps along the catwalk, counting every shadow, every reflection, every flicker. I felt the lingering presence of the apparent figure I had seen earlier, a memory amplified by the mind, but rooted in the platform's subtle control of perception. The lights had forced me to question my senses, to measure my reactions, and to remain disciplined in thought and action. I understood finally that Rule 6 isn't about avoiding an external threat, it's about surviving the internal one, the slow erosion of certainty that comes with isolation, fatigue, and environmental manipulation. Even now, when I recall that night, I can see the flickering lights and shadows on the deck, feel the tug of perception against reality, and understand the lesson embedded in Rule 6. Trusting what seems obvious can lead to subtle mistakes, cumulative misjudgments, and ultimately, dangerous consequences. The platform teaches this lesson continuously, in ways that are quiet but inescapable, reinforcing the necessity of vigilance, restraint, and measured attention. I carry the memory of that night as a guide, a reminder that automated systems offshore are tools, not authorities, and that perception is the line between survival and disaster. I learned Rule 7. Never enter the platform's observation tower alone after midnight. What you see there is not always real. On a night when fatigue had made my mind brittle, and the wind had picked up with a chill that penetrated even through my layered jacket, the stairwell leading to the tower seemed longer than usual, the metal railings cold and unforgiving under my gloved hands. I had convinced myself that a quick check of the monitoring systems at the top would be harmless, that following routine procedures would anchor me, but the moment I stepped onto the platform landing, I felt a weight, an oppressive awareness that hadn't been there before. Shadows twisted unnaturally around the tower supports, and for the first time, I felt the true meaning of isolation paranoia, the mental lens that dominates Rule 7. As I ascended, each step creaking under my weight, the wind intensified, and the blinking lights below the deck created misleading perspectives, casting false depths into the open space around me. The laminated card's warning echoed in my mind, a mantra against overconfidence and misjudgment. I kept telling myself that the tower was just a structure, steel and glass, with observation monitors and empty space, but a subtle sense of wrongness pressed in from every angle. Every movement of the wind, every shifting shadow, made me doubt my perception. The platform had a way of turning familiarity into something alien, and I realized that Rule 7 wasn't about physical danger alone. It was about surviving the distortion of your own senses. When I reached the top of the tower, the view should have been simple: open ocean, platform lights, and a distant horizon obscured by clouds. Instead, the horizon seemed to ripple, subtly shifting as if the water below were breathing, moving independently of the ocean currents I had memorized. I caught glimpses of shapes that seemed human, silhouettes standing on parts of the deck where no one should have been. My first impulse was to call down, but the wind carried my voice away, and I remembered the rule. Panic threatened to overtake me, but the laminated card had drilled restraint into every rotation, every inspection, every night spent learning to trust perception while doubting illusion. I walked slowly to the main observation console, monitoring readings and scanning the control panels, trying to anchor myself in tasks rather than imagination. My flashlight illuminated cables and screens, but the shadows cast by the automated lights flickered unpredictably, stretching across walls and ceiling like living forms. I noticed a reflection that seemed slightly delayed, mimicking gestures I hadn't made yet. The realization struck me hard. The tower amplifies the mind's susceptibility to suggestion, isolation, and fatigue. Every technician who disregarded Rule 7 had likely faced this manipulation, and the consequences were subtle yet profound, alterations in perception that could linger long after leaving the tower. Hours passed as I continued checks, documenting every fluctuation, every anomaly, and every faint shadow movement that might have been explained by natural causes. But explanations felt inadequate. The platform's influence was pervasive. I could feel it in the way shadows bent around corners, the subtle shifts in light reflections on monitors, and even in the sound of my own breathing. I understood that Rule 7 was about maintaining a tether to reality when every instinct and sensory input was compromised. Even the most rational thoughts were vulnerable up here, and discipline became the only shield against errors in judgment that might cost far more than physical safety. At one point, I thought I saw a colleague standing near the edge of the platform below, waving. My heart jumped, but as I focused, the figure dissolved, leaving only the empty deck and a slight shimmer in the lights. I froze, taking deliberate steps back from the railing, my mind racing with the realization that perception can be weaponized, amplified, and manipulated by the platform itself. Every prior rule, the echoes, the sealed compartments, the lights, culminated here in this tower, emphasizing observation and restraint. The laminated card had warned, but nothing prepares you for the immediate, palpable distortion of reality when fatigue, isolation, and environmental cues converge. The wind whipped more insistently around the tower, bending the steel supports and rattling panels, and I felt the space itself pressing in, compressing mental clarity. Each step across the catwalk atop the tower required focus, discipline, and constant verification of reality through instruments and memory. Shadows seemed to anticipate my motion, and even the reflections in my visor felt delayed or slightly off. I realized then that Rule 7 isn't just a guideline, it is a test, an enforced meditation on observation, awareness, and the mind's vulnerability. Survival depends not on physical endurance alone, but on the ability to parse reality from illusion, especially when the platform deliberately blurs the lines. Time became nearly irrelevant as I continued inspections, measuring structural supports, checking lighting sequences, and verifying readings from the observation consoles. Every flicker of light, every reflection, every shadow shift felt like a message, a test, a warning. I remembered the stories of other technicians who ignored the rule, how they would return disoriented, skeptical of their own memories, or changed in subtle, inexplicable ways. The psychological lens of Rule 7 is not about immediate danger, It is about the erosion of certainty, a slow, deliberate chipping away at confidence, perception, and mental stability. Eventually, I descended from the tower as dawn broke, the horizon appearing steadier, more reliable, though fatigue still weighed heavily on my shoulders. The empty deck below felt less threatening in daylight, but the impression of the night lingered, etched into memory and perception alike. I understood fully that Rule 7 is about preserving the mind, maintaining clarity in the face of manipulated sensory input, and recognizing that survival depends on careful observation, not impulse. Every step back to the living quarters was deliberate, grounded, and deliberate again, a small exercise in trust of reality tempered by caution. Even now, recalling that night in the observation tower, I can feel the wind whipping around me, the shadows stretching unnaturally, and the subtle dissonance between reflection and reality. The platform doesn't forget, and neither does the mind that adheres to Rule 7. Each rotation teaches that what seems obvious can be deceptive, and that trust in perception must always be measured, disciplined, and doubted when circumstances isolate you completely from certainty. The lesson is clear, subtle, and relentless, marking the line between mental survival and disorientation, fatigue, or worse. I first understood Rule 8. Never enter the maintenance tunnels below the platform during high tide. The rising water changes everything. When a routine check of the emergency pumps led me to the lower access hatch. The tide had been creeping up steadily, pushing against the support pillars with a slow, relentless force that made the entire rig seem less stable than it appeared during daylight hours. I had always thought of the tunnels as mundane passages, conduits for pipes and electrical lines, but the water amplified every sound, every vibration, and warped perception in a way I hadn't anticipated. My flashlight bounced across wet walls, reflecting off puddles in ways that suggested movement where none existed, and I remembered the laminated card warning that the rules exist for survival, not convenience. I hesitated at the edge of the hatch, my boots just brushing the cold metal threshold, considering the risk of stepping in too early. Even a shallow influx of water made footing uncertain, and the shadows reflected in the tunnel's slick surfaces shifted like living things. The warning of Rule 8 resurfaced with a weight I hadn't felt before, a subtle pressure in the back of my mind that demanded respect. Every instinct told me to wait, yet a sense of duty, checking the lines, verifying pumps, confirming pressure readings, urged me forward. Isolation magnifies responsibility, and I felt the full tension of being the only person making these decisions, knowing that a mistake could have consequences the laminated card never explicitly described. The moment I stepped inside the tunnel, the water rose around my boots, carrying a cold metallic scent that made my lungs feel tight. I focused on every step, careful not to disturb cables or pipes, while the tidal currents subtly shifted my balance. The lights overhead, designed to illuminate for safety, distorted reflections, making the tunnels appear longer, narrower, and filled with shapes that disappeared when I blinked. I realized that Rule 8 wasn't about water alone. It was about how environmental changes affect perception, how fatigue and isolation make ordinary passages disorienting, and how subtle shifts can amplify misjudgment. The tunnels themselves felt alive, bending perception in ways that made me doubt both my senses and my memory. I advanced deeper, using touch to verify the path ahead, while checking gauges and panels along the tunnel walls. Every puddle, every drip from the ceiling, seemed to carry an additional weight in darkness and echo. I noticed the water level subtly rising as I moved further, unnoticed in daylight but pronounced at high tide, making the space claustrophobic in a way that had nothing to do with physical dimensions. My breathing became measured, deliberate and cautious, a means to maintain focus and resist panic. The lessons from previous rules, echoes, sealed compartments, lights, towers, surfaced in my mind, converging into a cumulative awareness that kept me grounded. Hours passed as I methodically checked valves, panels, and junction boxes, the rising water reflecting shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I paused frequently, tracing cables with gloved hands, verifying the stability of the floor, and counting each step as if it were a lifeline. The laminated card's rule echoed silently in memory, a safeguard against overconfidence. Rule 8 demanded restraint and full attention. Even a small lapse, a misstep, a misread gauge, or an assumption that everything was unchanged could have cascading effects amplified by the pressure of isolation and the tidal water pressing against the platform supports. I became hyper-aware of the tunnel walls, how every crack, pipe, and joint reflected light differently as my headlamp moved, and how even subtle currents created illusions of movement in the water. Shadows lengthened and shifted as though following me, a psychological effect magnified by fatigue and stress. I reminded myself that the platform isn't alive in a literal sense, but it is aware through the structures, the rules, and the influence of isolation on human perception. Following Rule 8 required constant mental engagement, a battle to distinguish reality from suggestion, while maintaining physical safety in increasingly precarious conditions. The tunnels narrowed at points, forcing me to crouch or step sideways, with water now brushing the knees of my coveralls. I noticed the air felt heavier, carrying a faint but persistent metallic tang, and each breath became a test of attention. Even simple tasks, checking valves, reading dials, documenting shifts, required heightened focus to avoid misjudgment. I realized that Rule 8 operates on multiple levels. It enforces respect for environmental hazards, demands vigilance in navigation, and trains the mind to recognize subtle inconsistencies. One misstep in such confined water-filled spaces could be fatal, and the platform's design ensures that mistakes are immediately perceptible to those who have survived long enough to notice. By the time I reached the furthest junction, I had mapped every puddle, verified every pipe, and confirmed the integrity of the structural supports. Yet even with meticulous documentation, the tunnels retained an oppressive, distorted quality. The interplay of water, shadows, and reflections made orientation difficult, and I found myself double-checking each gauge, confirming my steps, and occasionally freezing to let my eyes adjust to illusions created by my own fatigue. I understood then that Rule 8 is as much about psychological resilience as physical caution. The water isn't the danger alone, it's the effect it has on the mind and perception, and the rule preserves both. Eventually, I retraced my path toward the hatch, aware that the tide was beginning to ebb, but that the memory of disorientation and altered perception would linger. My body was exhausted, muscles tight from crouching and stepping carefully, but my mind remained alert, every instinct heightened by the persistent awareness of the platform's influence. I knew fully that violating Rule 8 or ignoring its guidance, even momentarily, could have lasting consequences. The lesson wasn't learned through injury or disaster alone, it was learned in awareness, in attention to every detail, and in respect for the subtle manipulations that isolation, environmental changes, and fatigue impose. Even now, recalling that night, I can feel the cold press of tidal water against my boots, hear the subtle echoes of drops in the tunnel, and sense the stretching shadows on walls that weren't quite where they seemed. Rule 8 remains one of the clearest examples of how the platform trains attention, enforces discipline, and embeds survival principles into the mind of anyone who navigates its spaces. It is subtle, insistent, and unavoidable, and ignoring it is not merely a risk, it is a threat to the fragile balance that keeps technicians alive and sane offshore. I first understood Rule 9. Never trust the intercom system after 11 p.m. It may relay voices that aren't speaking to you during a long night shift, when the rig felt particularly empty, and every familiar sound seemed distorted by fatigue. The intercom had always been a mundane tool. Alerts, announcements, occasional check-ins. But after hours of isolation, the system began to feel like something else entirely. A voice came through, soft, measured, seemingly from the control room, calling my name and giving instructions I didn't remember requesting. My first instinct was to respond, but the laminated card's warning about Rule 9 surged into my memory, a quiet but urgent reminder not to act on impulses that could be traps. I paused in the corridor, hand hovering over the nearest communication panel, and tried to rationalize the sound. Fatigue does strange things to perception, and after weeks offshore, your mind invents company in empty spaces. Yet the voice was precise, almost conversational, repeating information I didn't recognize, and referencing tasks that weren't assigned. I realized immediately that the platform's systems were more than mechanical. They reflected attention, expectation, and perhaps even manipulated sensory input in ways that aren't obvious. Each tone, each inflection, forced me to question what was real. Listening without reacting became the only safe option, and I reminded myself constantly that Rule 9 was about survival, not convenience. Hours passed as the intercom occasionally emitted static bursts or soft, indistinct chatter. Sometimes it seemed a colleague was giving instructions from a different deck, and other times it was my own name, called out in patterns that mimicked routine communication. My mind was exhausted, but I forced myself to stay methodical, recording readings, inspecting valves, and documenting anomalies, as if the intercom were entirely irrelevant. The lesson of Rule 9 is subtle. It teaches that in isolation, your instincts are vulnerable, and systems that seem ordinary can exploit that vulnerability. Responding impulsively is a slow erosion of judgment. I moved through the platform, checking gauges and lighting sequences, the intercom continuing its eerie, intermittent chatter. Every announcement, every fragment of a word, was filtered through a mental lens trained for skepticism. Shadows in hallways seemed to move in time with the vocal patterns, and reflections in steel panels occasionally showed shapes that weren't actually there. The platform's memory, and perhaps its subtle manipulations, ensured that even mundane tools became instruments of observation and psychological testing. Rule 9 was now ingrained as an instinct, a mental safeguard that kept me alive and sane as hours dragged on. At one point, I thought I heard a supervisor giving urgent instructions, telling me to check a valve I knew had already been inspected. My hands tensed, but I did not respond. The platform had conditioned me to wait, observe, and verify independently. Each repetition of the intercom voice made my mind race, measuring the risk between compliance and survival. The psychological weight of the rule was heavier than any physical hazard. The danger was in reaction, in trusting an input that appeared authoritative but was untrustworthy. I felt my heart pound with the realization that one wrong response could spiral into consequences, both immediate and lingering. Hours blended into one another as I continued my rounds, occasionally pausing to let the voice pattern dissipate, to allow my mind to recalibrate. The platform's quiet hums and vibrations punctuated the silence, a reminder that physical systems operate independently of perception, but perception governs behavior. I noted minor inconsistencies in readings and shadows, all amplified by the intercom's sporadic signals. Following Rule 9 meant more than listening carefully. It required mental discipline, vigilance, and awareness that perception can be manipulated by systems designed to test adherence and caution. By the end of the night, I had documented every anomaly, verified equipment, and avoided reacting to any auditory input that might have seemed authoritative. The intercom continued its intermittent, fragmented transmissions, but I maintained focus, anchoring myself through tangible tasks rather than imagined instruction. Rule 9 was no longer a suggestion. It was a survival mechanism, a psychological filter embedded to maintain clarity when isolation, fatigue, and auditory manipulation threatened to erode judgment. Even now, recalling that night, I can hear the faint echo of my name through the intercom, the cadence familiar yet wrong, and I understand the platform's subtle lesson. Trusting the ordinary, especially in isolation, can be dangerous. Rule 9 enforced discipline and awareness, a shield against the mind's own vulnerability to suggestion, fatigue, and auditory deception. Without it, I might not have maintained the clarity necessary to navigate the rest of the rotation safely, and I feel its imprint every time I approach the intercom, every time I hear my name in a space that should be empty. I first discovered Rule 10. Never leave the control room unattended during system anomalies. The rig's feedback loops can trap you on a night when multiple alarms blink simultaneously across the panels, each one demanding verification, adjustment, and precise documentation. The room felt impossibly small, though it was standard in dimensions. and the displays reflected a surreal combination of color and light that made the steel console surfaces seem liquid under my gaze. I knew I had to stay put, because even a brief absence could cause cascading effects, minor errors amplified by feedback loops into mechanical anomalies or perception distortions. My hands hovered over the controls, trembling slightly from adrenaline and fatigue, as the laminated card's warning about Rule 10 resurfaced vividly in my mind. As I monitored pressure gauges, power flows, and communication lines, every decision seemed simultaneously critical and uncertain. The rig's automated systems interacted in ways that were invisible, but felt palpable, subtle vibrations running through the flooring and the walls. The alarm's intermittent tones echoed in the room, but more unnervingly, the readings themselves began to fluctuate in patterns that didn't correspond with actual changes. I realized that these feedback loops were not simply technical, they exploited human perception and attention, forcing me to engage fully with the systems and with myself. Ignoring Rule 10 even for a moment would have been disastrous, because the platform's design magnified errors, missteps, and hesitation. I had to continuously cross-check readings against physical indicators, valves, meters, and circuit panels. Every flicker of the monitor, every unexpected spike, demanded verification and adjustment. The feedback loops amplified not just errors, but uncertainty, the insidious kind that makes you question whether a reading is wrong or your mind is failing. I understood that the control room wasn't just a command hub, it was a crucible for mental endurance. Rule 10 embedded a form of discipline that went beyond mechanics. It was about presence, attention, and resilience, against subtle manipulations that could be psychological as much as operational. Hours passed as I maintained vigilance, tracing every anomaly to its source, recalibrating sensors, and documenting deviations meticulously. The room's lights flickered, reflecting off polished surfaces and creating phantom patterns that suggested movement. My eyes ached, my muscles cramped, and yet leaving the station, even for a moment, was not an option. The platform's design, the feedback loops, and my own fatigue converged into a state where perception could be unreliable, and adherence to Rule 10 became both shield and anchor. Every correction I made, every confirmation, reinforced my sense of stability amid the slowly eroding certainty of the environment. I remembered colleagues who had disregarded this rule in previous rotations, drawn away by curiosity or fatigue, only to return disoriented, unsure which anomalies were real and which were manifestations of perception manipulated by the platform. I understood then that Rule 10 was as much about psychological survival as mechanical safety. The feedback loops didn't punish instantly. They eroded judgment, twisted perception, and punished hesitation in cumulative, almost imperceptible ways. Remaining in the control room, engaged and disciplined, was the only way to prevent this slow collapse of focus. At one point, a false spike appeared on the primary pressure gauge, showing levels beyond safe operating limits. My heart raced, but I verified manually, cross-referencing with secondary instruments, confirming that the anomaly was a glitch amplified by the system. The interdependence of controls, alarms, and feedback loops made the room a labyrinth where errors compounded if left unchecked. I reminded myself repeatedly of Rule 10 and the importance of staying present and attentive. Leaving even briefly would have broken the chain of observation, allowing minor anomalies to evolve into critical failures. By the middle of the night, my fatigue was profound, but leaving the control room was still unthinkable. My vision blurred, yet I forced myself to check each reading twice, triple-check each alarm sequence, and ensure that all critical systems were accounted for. The feedback loops created subtle distortions, readouts flickered, lights seemed to hesitate, and sounds echoed in ways that suggested multiple presences. Following Rule 10 required a balance of discipline, awareness, and mental endurance that left no room for distraction. The platform rewarded vigilance and punished assumption, and the laminated card's guidance was the only compass I had. Even as dawn approached, I remained at the console, exhausted but alert, aware that each alarm, each fluctuation, and each reflected shadow represented a challenge to perception and attention. The feedback loops persisted, subtle, pervasive, and relentless, shaping the environment and my responses. I realized fully that Rule 10 wasn't about staying in a room. It was about maintaining engagement, focus, and discernment in an environment designed to test every lapse. Mental survival here was inseparable from procedural adherence, and every rotation reinforced that the rules were crafted from experience, observation, and the necessity of preventing small mistakes from growing into disaster. Even now, recalling that night in the control room, I can feel the constant hum of systems, the faint vibration under my feet, the flickering reflections across monitors, and the subtle uncertainty each anomaly introduced. Rule 10 is a reminder that presence and discipline are inseparable, that the platform tests more than skill, it tests perception, endurance, and attention under pressure. The lesson remains vivid, a mental imprint that guides every subsequent night shift, every interaction with feedback loops, and every decision to remain vigilant in spaces where leaving, even momentarily, could have consequences far beyond what the eye sees. I first understood Rule 11. Never ignore the platform's silent signals. They communicate warnings that voices and alarms cannot. During the third week of my rotation, when the rig's hum felt different, as if it were measuring my attention and patience simultaneously, I had been moving between decks, checking readings, and performing routine inspections, when I noticed subtle changes, a slight vibration in the metal floor, a faint shift in overhead panels, and a barely perceptible smell of ozone that hadn't been there before. At first, I dismissed these signals as fatigue-induced illusions, the kind that offshore life breeds after days without proper sleep. But each small anomaly accumulated, creating a tension in the pit of my stomach, and I remembered the laminated card's admonition. Rule 11 isn't about obvious threats. It's about perceiving what cannot be measured in conventional ways. The silent signals were everywhere if you were alert. Doors that had been closed would shift slightly ajar. Pipes and cables would produce vibrations that seemed to move in patterns, almost like a heartbeat. My initial thought was paranoia, yet the platform's memory, structure, and subtle environmental cues suggested otherwise. These signals demanded interpretation, careful observation, and deliberate action. Ignoring them, as the card warned, could allow small disturbances to escalate into critical, often imperceptible failures. I realized then that Rule 11 required more than attention. It demanded intuition sharpened by respect for the rig's subtle warnings. I moved slowly through the corridors, listening and feeling for changes that might indicate a problem before any alarm sounded. My hands traced railings, my feet tapped along flooring, and every breath became deliberate, measured. The platform's silent signals were deceptive in their subtlety, revealing truths only to those willing to observe meticulously. Shadows shifted unexpectedly, reflections lingered longer than light should allow, and vibrations suggested movement beyond the immediate environment. Following Rule 11 meant suspending instinctive reactions to ordinary stimuli, interpreting them in the context of everything I had learned from prior rules, and acknowledging that survival depended on perception more than reaction. Hours passed as I continued inspections, and the silent signals grew more insistent. I noticed slight shifts in pressure gauges that didn't correspond with operational changes, faintly warped reflections in polished metal panels, and tiny alterations in the platform's vibration patterns. Each subtle cue carried meaning, demanding response without creating panic. I traced every anomaly with deliberate caution, documenting and verifying, understanding that these imperceptible warnings could prevent far larger issues. Rule 11 demanded not only attention but patience, a continuous engagement with the rig that required the mind to remain vigilant, even when exhaustion pressed heavily against it. At one point, I observed a minor misalignment in a hatch panel, something so small that it could have been overlooked easily. Yet my awareness of the silent signals alerted me to its significance. A small adjustment corrected the misalignment, and for a moment, I wondered how many past rotations had suffered unnoticed because technicians ignored these quiet communications. The platform communicates not just through alarms or lights, but through the subtle feedback of structure, material, and motion. And Rule 11 encapsulates the necessity of tuning perception to these silent warnings. Every small correction reinforced my confidence, while reminding me how fragile that perception could be. The day wore on, but the rig demanded constant vigilance. Shadows, reflections, vibrations, and even temperature variations conveyed subtle messages, each requiring interpretation and careful response. I understood that Rule 11 was cumulative in nature, synthesizing lessons from all prior rules: the echoes, the lights, the towers, the tunnels, the intercom, and the control room feedback loops all contributed to a complex language of subtle signals, and ignoring them could erode situational awareness almost imperceptibly. This rule was about mental calibration, teaching that the rig speaks quietly to those who listen and punishes inattentiveness in ways that are not immediately apparent. By late afternoon, after meticulous inspection and careful adjustment of every minor anomaly, I felt the platform's presence less as a machine and more as an environment that required constant dialogue, silent but exacting. Every vibration, every shift, every faint smell or shadow carried significance. I realized that Rule 11 demanded humility, an acknowledgement that the rig is not passive, that survival depends on understanding communication beyond conventional senses, and that errors often arise not from negligence, but from misinterpretation or dismissal of subtle warning signs. Even after my shift ended, the memory of the silent signals lingered, a persistent awareness of everything I had learned. The platform's communication is subtle, requiring attention, patience, and restraint. Ignoring even minor cues could escalate into unpredictable consequences. I knew that following Rule 11 would continue to guide me, not just during rotations but in the spaces between alertness and fatigue, perception and reality. The rule is absolute, insistent, and unforgiving in its silence. And as I reflect on the culmination of all 11 rules, I feel the weight of every echo, shadow, vibration, and subtle signal that the platform demands we respect. Survival offshore is not just mechanical skill, it is the discipline to observe, interpret, and act upon the imperceptible. The laminated card, the echoes, the lights, the tower, the tunnels, the intercom, the control room, everything converges in this principle, the quiet insistence that perception is survival and attention is life. I step back from the panel, the rig settling into its daily rhythm, the silent signals fading but never gone, and feel the quiet pulse of awareness that Rule 11 has instilled. Every rotation, every shift, every moment in isolation reinforces that survival is about listening to what isn't spoken, watching what isn't obvious, and moving with restraint, even when instinct demands otherwise. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.